Welcome students to exercise 13, which is going to focus on gross muscular anatomy. This will actually be the first of two lectures. The first lecture will go over some of the more kind of generic information, and the second lecture will then go over some of the major muscles that we will expect you to know. So in terms of what we will expect you to know, we are going to talk a little bit about terminology and the different functional groups and the way muscles function. We are going to review how muscles are named. We can actually learn a whole lot about a muscle by looking at its name, so that's definitely an important thing to go over. And then for the 45 or so muscles that we've chosen, which are kind of the major muscles of the body, you'll need to be able to identify it. So on a diagram, on a figure, tell me what it looks like, tell me its origin and insertion, which is how it attaches to the skeleton. What is its primary action? Why do we have this particular muscle? What does it do for us? And then what is its antagonist? And we'll talk about agonists and antagonists and what those terms mean here in just a second. So let's start with some kind of general information about how muscles attach to the skeleton. So muscles actually have at least two attachment points. They have an origin, which is their stationary or immovable attachment point, and then they have an insertion, which is the movable attachment point. Now, some muscles have more than one origin, so that's why we say at least 2 points, but every muscle will have an origin and insertion. And when a particular muscle contracts, the insertion of that muscle moves closer to its origin. So in this example here with the brachialis, you can see it originates here on the middle of the humerus and inserts down here on the ulna. And when the brachialis contracts, the ulna moves closer to the humerus and the forearm is flexed at the elbow. And that is true of all of our muscles. When that particular muscle contracts, its insertion point will move closer to its origin point. The way to think of muscles is to think of them in what we call functional groups. Kind of pairs almost. So an agonist is a prime mover for a particular movement. So if I were to ask you something like, what is the agonist or prime mover for forearm flexion? Well, then you would answer me whatever muscle it is that causes forearm flexion. The antagonist is the muscle that moves the same joint but in the opposite direction. So for example, when the biceps brachii is contracted, the forearm flexes. When the forearm flexes with the biceps brachii contracted, its antagonist, the triceps brachii, is relaxed. When the triceps brachii contracts and extends the forearm, its antagonist then, the biceps brachii, is relaxed. So they move the same joint. They're both moving the elbow joint, but they're moving them in opposite directions. So there are a couple of kind of shortcuts when it comes to the muscle pairs. Typically, a muscle on the anterior side of a joint is going to cause flexion at that joint. Typically, a muscle that is on the posterior side of a joint is going to cause extension at that joint. The exception to that is the knee, in which case it's the posterior muscle that flexes the knee and the anterior muscle that extends the knee. That is not typical. An anterior muscle is going to cause flexion, posterior muscle causes extension. Great example here is the pectoralis major. That's going to cause arm flexion because it's on the front of the body. The latissimus dorsi here on the posterior side is then going to cause extension of the arm at the shoulder joint. A muscle that is on the lateral side of a joint typically causes abduction of that joint. That's what you see the deltoid here doing. And a muscle that is on the medial side of a joint, like the teres major here, is then going to cause adduction of that joint. So those are just a couple little shortcuts that can help you look at kind of some of this functional group stuff. And again, same joint. They're moving the same joint. They're just moving them in opposite directions. We also then have muscles that we call synergists, which are basically helper muscles. They might add a little more force to the same movement, make it a little stronger, a little heftier. So for instance, the brachialis helps the biceps brachii to cause forearm flexion, to make that a stronger movement. They also might kind of try to reduce some unnecessary movement and kind of stabilize the movement a little bit. For example, we have a particular type of synergist called a fixator, which actually kind of rock solid immobilizes an origin. So for instance, the epicranius muscle here, which covers your head, the occipitalis in the back is then connected to the frontalis in the front by this aponeurosis here. The frontalis raises your eyebrows, but in order to do that, it has to have a really solid kind of point from which to originate, and it just originates on this aponeurosis. So the occipitalis contracts, that pulls this taut, and then the frontalis can raise your eyebrows. So the occipitalis acts as a fixator for the frontalis. Now, where muscles get confusing to students sometimes is that the same muscle is going to be the prime mover for one type of movement, an antagonist for a different type of movement, and very often will be a synergist for a third movement. So we really are going to try to just focus on kind of what is the major action for each of these muscles. Because if we got into all the synergists, we might get a little lost. But the book and the lab manual, they both list the primary action in a different color. So try not to get lost in all of the stuff that our muscles do. The other thing that is incredibly, I actually think, very helpful about muscles is that you can look at the name of a muscle and actually learn a whole lot of information about that muscle. So rather than trying to memorize everything, you can actually dissect the name of a muscle and figure out a whole lot of information about what that muscle may be in terms of its shape, in terms of its kind of relative size, where it might be located, how many origins it has, actually what those origins and insertions might be, what it does, what its action is, in which direction are the fibers running. So it's really, really helpful to look at the names of the muscles. Now, the names of the muscles by and large are in Latin. Some of them are Greek, but most of it's Latin. So please do be aware of that. So if we look at direction, we're talking about in which direction are the muscle fascicles running in relation to the long axis of the body. So rectus muscles are straight muscles. Their muscle fibers are running with the long axis of the body. Transverse or transversus muscles have fibers that run at right angles to the long axis of the body, so horizontally on a transverse plane. And then oblique muscles are muscles whose fibers are running at some angle that is a non-right angle to the long axis of the body. We can also look at relative size. If we were to look at a particular muscle group, you have maximus muscles. Those are going to be the biggest muscle in that group. Minimus muscles are going to be the smallest muscle in that group. You also have medius muscles, which are then in the middle. Brevis is the Latin word for short, so those muscles are going to be shorter than the longest muscles, which are going to be long. You can also look at the name of a muscle and determine where it is located. So for instance, you have a muscle called the rectus femoris muscle. The rectus part says us that the fibers are running straight with the long axis of the body. The femoris part tells us that that muscle is located over the femur. We can also look at number of origins. Biceps muscles have 2 origins, triceps muscles have 3 origins, quadriceps muscles have 4 origins. Some muscles actually in their name tell you where they originate and insert. The origin is the beginning of the name and the insertion is the end of the name. So if we look at a muscle called the sternocleidomastoid muscle, cleido is another word for clavicle, so we have sternum, clavicle, mastoid process. So this particular muscle originates on the sternum and the clavicle and inserts on the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So just by looking at the name of the muscle, we know that that muscle is located in the neck and it is going to move the head. Then you can look at muscle names, and they will actually tell you what they are going to do right in the name of the muscle. So you have muscles that are called flexor muscles, which are going to be muscles that cause flexion. You have extensor muscles that cause extension. You have abductor muscles, adductor muscles, etc., etc., etc. And then also you can look at muscles sometimes and look at their names and tell what shape they are. So for instance, anytime you see the word orbicular or orbicularis, that means that that muscle has a circular shape. So there are about 700 named muscles in the body. No, you do not need to know all 700. I think it's probably about 45 or so. We've picked kind of just the main muscles of the body. In terms of kind of conquering muscles, take your time. Try not to get overwhelmed. Look at one part of the body at a time. Look at just the head and neck muscles. Look at just the arm muscles, just the leg muscles, etc., etc., etc. Focus on those generalities before you dive into the specifics. Get really comfortable with that. Well, this muscle causes flexion, its agonist is going to cause extension, etc., etc. And of course, as we just discussed, dissect the name of the muscle. So for instance, if I were to ask you what can we learn about a muscle called the flexor carpi radialis? Well, the flexor part tells us that it's going to cause flexion. The carpi part tells us that it's going to flex the wrist. And the radialis part tells us that it is located over the radius. So instead of trying to memorize everything, you can actually just look at the name of the muscle and learn a whole lot about that particular muscle. So the way I broke the muscles up is into the head and neck muscles, the trunk muscles, upper limb, and then pelvic girdle and lower limb. So in terms of the head and neck, we're going to look at facial expression muscles then that are involved in mastication, or what we call chewing, and then muscles that move the neck, so and the head on the neck. Then we're going to look at anterior and posterior trunk muscles in terms of our breathing muscles and our postural muscles, the muscles of the abdominal wall, and then the shoulder muscles, which will then move the arm. Once we are in the upper limb, the arm muscles are muscles that act on the forearm, and the forearm muscles are muscles that act on the wrist and hand. If we look at the pelvic girdle and lower limb, the pelvic muscles are going to move the thigh muscles are going to act on the leg, and the leg muscles are going to act on the ankle and the foot. And so when you get the kind of list of all the muscles, you want to look at them kind of in these categories, in these sections. Don't try to do it all at once. It's too overwhelming, but take it section by section, and I promise you muscles are infinitely, infinitely conquerable.